Good morning. My name is Patrick Hornbeck, and I'm a professor of theology at Fordham University in New York City. I'm also a third-year student in the part-time JD program at Fordham Law School. And those dual identities, as a theologian and as a student of the law, are informing the presentation I'm honored to give this morning. I'm interested in looking at the ways in which one particular set of legal doctrines, the so-called ministerial exception, affects the mission and the work of Christian and religiously affiliated liberal arts colleges in this particular moment in history. And so I want to start off with a hypothetical. Imagine any sort of workplace, but imagine an employer and an employee who don't quite get along, and one day the employer summons the employee into her office and says, "You're fired," and then adds that the reason that she's firing the employee is precisely because of the employee's race, the employee's gender, the employee's national origin, or disability, or so forth. Now, in almost every circumstance, that would be illegal. It would be a violation of Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the sort of bedrock statute governing discrimination and prohibiting it in employment contexts. But imagine now that it's a religious employer, whether that be a mosque or a church school or a religiously affiliated nonprofit. And imagine that the employee is somehow a key employee. Maybe it's a clergy member, maybe it's a theologian, maybe it's somebody else. And then imagine that same scenario. And it turns out that under the current Supreme Court case law, that very same firing, for that reason that would otherwise have been impermissible, may actually, in fact, be permitted. And permitted even when there isn't a religious basis for the termination, no doctrine of the sponsoring religious organization that would compel the employer to fire that particular employee. That's what's meant by the legal doctrine of the ministerial exception, the idea that even though Congress didn't write this into the Civil Rights Act, it's constitutionally necessary that there be an immunity for certain religious organizations when it comes to terminating and possibly taking other actions against certain kinds of employees. That's a thing that really shocks people. It's not something we tend to talk about as much as we might in religious higher education and in other religious employment settings. The reason for this doctrine comes out of the Supreme Court's reading of the First Amendment. In fact, both halves of the First Amendment. The part that says that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, and also the part saying that Congress shan't prohibit the free exercise of religion. And the Supreme Court has read those two clauses together in light of the history that confronted the US framers. And we have to remember, of course, that prior to the Revolutionary War, in many of the North American colonies of England, ministers were appointed by the crown, and local citizens, and particularly local churches, may not have had very much to say about it. So what the court has held is that for the government to say, no, a religious institution cannot choose who is ministering in its name, that would be tantamount to government establishing a religion. And it would certainly be tantamount to government prohibiting a religious institution from exercising its religion the way that it wants. The most recent case on this point came down just a little under a year ago, last summer, called Our Lady of Guadalupe School versus Morrissey Beirut. It was a case involving an elementary school teacher at a Catholic parochial school in Los Angeles. Not only did the Supreme Court reaffirm this idea of the ministerial exception, but it broadened the category of who might fall within it. As Justice Samuel Alito wrote for the majority in that case, any employee with important religious functions may be subject to termination, notwithstanding the provisions of our anti-discrimination law. Now, that decision left a whole bunch of questions unanswered. Who falls into this category? It seems that fifth grade teachers that do some work in teaching their students about religion might. We don't know if it applies in higher education. We don't know if it applies in religiously affiliated healthcare. So a lot of questions about how broad exactly this immunity for religious employers goes. Who decides what's an important religious function? You could imagine that a terminated employee and her employer might disagree about that. And courts are very hesitant to come in and say that one person's version of religious doctrine is right when the religious body itself is saying something different. And then what kind of claims are exempt? Certainly the ministerial exception covers termination claims, but what about when the employee is saying, I'm still an employee, but you violated my employment contract in some sort of way? Or what if the employee says, I'm still an employee, but you've created a hostile work environment because of my sex or my race or my religion? The court is yet to clarify that. In fact, a lot of cases are working their way through the lower courts, even as I'm giving this presentation. But the bottom line is this from the legal side of things. For better or worse, US courts have given significant discretion over the hiring and firing of key religious employees to religious organizations. It's part of a broader trend that we've seen within the US judiciary over the last 10 to 20 years toward what some commentators have called a greater doctrine of church autonomy. The idea that courts would be overstepping their constitutional bounds to step into certain kinds of disputes involving religious institutions, their practices, their employees, and so on and so forth. So if that's the legal background, let me raise the normative question for those of us who are involved in religiously affiliated and specifically Christian liberal arts education, like those of us here at this conference. The question becomes, if an institution is given the prerogative to discriminate and has the prerogative to do so immune from the normal operation of anti-discrimination law, should the institution take advantage of that prerogative, or should the institution hold itself to a standard that's higher than the court might feel comfortable doing? And that's fundamentally not at all a legal question. It's a theological and an ethical question. And there's a lot of interesting literature recently on the questions of ethics in universities. I point you to the excellent books by James Keenan and Jerry Beyer, both working in the Roman Catholic tradition, among others. So I want to suggest three things for those of us who work in institutions, and particularly for those who have responsibilities of leadership within religiously affiliated institutions that have to grapple with questions like this, as we think about how to live out our faith commitments in the context of an increasingly complex legal landscape. So the first is, if this is a theological and ethical question, it's imperative that religiously affiliated institutions consult the fullness of their own teaching. I can't think of a major religious group that doesn't have substantive teaching on things like employment. What are the just ways that employers and employees should relate to one another? I think there's also questions that come up about the dignity of the human person. And there's questions that come up, and I'll speak just out of the Christian tradition for a minute, about where exactly it is necessary to draw a line between that which is morally permissible and that which is legally permissible. Very often this gets talked about in terms of complicity or cooperation with evil, for instance. And so in the case of an employee who might be violating the doctrine of the founding religious tradition, there might be extra principles for an institution to consult there. A second point I want to make is a practical one, which is to say that these sorts of terminations, although legally permissible, are often really quite problematic when it comes to the institution standing in the broader marketplace as an employer and as a witness to the faith that it holds. Many of the stories that have emerged about employees who have been fired for reasons that would otherwise be impermissible, but that are permitted under the ministerial exception, have generated a tremendous amount of animosity toward the firing religious tradition, the institution itself, the denomination, if it's sitting within a denomination, and even the idea of religious employers in general. And so I think that we should think carefully about what sorts of messages we are giving as employers working within religious traditions about where we feel we are subject to the law and where we feel it's necessary to claim these exemptions that courts might be offering. And as a compromise proposal, one thing that religious institutions might consider doing is the third point I want to make, which is giving notice to those employees whom the religious institution deems to be performing the kinds of religious functions that might qualify that employee to be subject to this ministerial exception. Certainly from experiences that I've heard about in many cases that I've read, it seems that very often the employees who fall within this exception have no idea about it until after they've been terminated. And very often that sends not just a message of antagonism and exclusion, but almost one of unfair play. And so it seems that one way that might help to lower the temperature and create some breathing room around employment practices in religious institutions is for those institutions to say up front, we're delighted to welcome you to our team. We regard your particular position as being ministerial, and here are the consequences that flow from it. Whatever solution each individual religious institution lands on, I think has to in the end be a matter of conscience. It can't just be one of obeying the law. If we're living in the midst of mission-oriented, religiously affiliated institutions of higher education or any other sort, what we believe theologically has to shape the way in which we act as employers. Thanks so very much for listening.
When I started at Xavier, my role included support of all of our students who were not Catholic. So the Presbyterian pastor was also the advisor to the Muslim Student Association. Obviously, dialogue comes with the territory when that's your job description, but I find that even for folks for whom that's not true, dialogue is urgent. When I was in college in a small town, a county north of where I live now, a cross was burned on the lawn of a family in our college town. White supremacy felt like a boogeyman that would occasionally come out and do terrible and evil things, but that we hoped and tried to keep at bay. Now we know it's different. There's a better sense of the systems of white supremacy. There is more communication and ability to see the ugliness when Black men are killed by police. And so in the same week that Derek Chauvin is on trial in Minnesota, on Good Friday, white supremacists came on our campus and ripped down for the second time a banner that said, "Racism is a sin, Black Lives Matter." They also destroyed the parish's Stations of the Cross that were geared towards the justice concerns that are going on in our country right now. It's urgent. People on our campus don't feel safe. Our Black students don't feel safe or protected. Our students of color widely are unsure about their place at our predominantly white institution. Our Asian students struggle with feeling invisible as hate against them grows. These concerns are urgent. The other thing that gives me a personal sense of urgency around dialogue as both a practice and a way to teach is realizing that so many of the identities that I carry, the traditions that have formed me, also form some of the people who are committing white supremacist terrorist acts right now. Just a couple of years ago, when there was a shooting in Poway, California at a synagogue, within a week, the shooter was identified as someone who was an active attendee at a Presbyterian church. I'm Presbyterian. Certainly my first sense was to be defensive. They're not my kind of Presbyterian. But the reality is the roots of his faith tradition are the same as the roots of my faith tradition. And that particular shooter closed out his manifesto with words of praise for God that weren't that different than my own words of praise. And so this is urgent because of the damage, the terror, the evil that is happening around us, and the people, our brothers and sisters, our communities, ourselves, who are being harmed by these oppressive hierarchies that we need to resist. Jesus was often in dialogue as the way he formed the people around him. One of my favorite episodes is the parable of the Good Samaritan. And so often we focus on the ethics of that situation and the parable itself and what it means for us as Christians. We skip over how Jesus got to telling that story in the first place. Jesus was asked a question about the law. He returned that question with a question. And then when asked a follow-up, after answering and completing sort of the first cycle, he offers a parable. I am compelled to follow Jesus in a way that isn't just in the content of what Jesus offers, but in the way that I see Jesus interacting with people in a way consistent with that content he offers. That if in the Good Samaritan parable, he asks us, he invites us, he challenges us, he even tells us it's obligatory to help the other, to break down the social barriers that keep us from doing so, to flatten hierarchies, then what sense does it make to live in a way that supports hierarchies, to teach in a way that supports hierarchies? And so as someone who forms others, as someone who follows Jesus, as someone who tries to teach, then also I find it faithful to the God I know, to the God I serve, to the Jesus I follow, to the Spirit that nourishes and sustains me, to teach in a way that cares for our students as whole people, that sees them as active in their own creation of knowledge and exchange with each other, that sees them as mutual partners in our communal search for truth. I am invited to teach in a way that breaks down those hierarchies. So I want to talk to you a little bit about what that means for me and invite you to do the same. When racial bias incidents happen near or on our campus, students want to talk about it. They want to talk about it soon. They want to talk about what's relevant. And so often they think the best place for that is the classroom. No matter whether the classroom is a place that deals with chemistry or deals with philosophy. Our professors, on the other hand, often feel like they might not be equipped for that because the content is not where they're experts. They don't know how to do dialogue themselves. And so I think the first step for both using dialogue as a tool for pedagogy, but also for being able to have meaningful dialogue in our classroom is to teach the tools. We have to teach tools like active listening and facilitation to our professors, and we have to give our students spaces when it is not high pressure, when we are not immediately responding to something traumatic, but instead as a regular part of our curriculum, for them to gain those same skills. Do they know how to actively listen? Do they know how to strategically think through the goal of a dialogue or a conversation and how it differs from debate? These are not skills they come to our campuses with. They have to learn them. And so if dialogue is going to be a part of how they generate knowledge, how they live in the world, they're going to have to learn how to do it. The second important tactic I find is to assign dialogue and provide time for it. You can't slide these things in as an extra. You can't assume that they're just going to want to, or it's going to be something that can be added onto the content you already provide that feels so central to their learning experience. Dialogue is rigorous. It demands a lot of them, and it demands the time and investment to allow for that to happen. But also to make dialogue practices in our curriculum effective, we also need time afterwards to review what happened, to reflect on it in writing, and to find other ways to make meaning from the conversation itself. And so I find that these three components of both teaching the students some skills, giving them an active space within our classroom setting to practice dialogue, whether it's with a particular individual who might be coming into the classroom or with each other, and then reflecting afterwards, either in the classroom as a group, in writing, or both, are the components that make it really important to go beyond debate in the ways that we talk to each other. I want to share a story from that trip. We had just heard from a pair of staff people from Seeds of Peace, an organization that brings together youth who are both Palestinian and Israeli to spend time together in community at a camp in Maine. This went so well as a way to help students deal with the trauma and understand what was going on around them and become change makers, that Seeds of Peace then began offering this same camp to young people in other conflict regions. The two staff people who spoke to us were alums of the camp and staff of the organization. And so they talked about their own personal stories around their identities, their nationalities, their religious identities, and how that had to do with the conflict. It was a hard conversation. It was hard to listen to. It was hard, I think, for the staff who shared it with us. And it challenged some of the students' notions of what was really going on in Israel. But the best part of it, I thought, was when they made plain and clear how they do dialogue. And one of their first suggestions was, what do you want to get out of each conversation? Because so often in our classrooms, our students find themselves wanting to convince each other that they are right. And if that is your goal, you're probably going to fail. But if you want to learn more about the other person, if you want to be heard or understood, you can set different goals for a conversation that might be much more productive and likely will lead to better outcomes both in the relationship and in the content of what you're dealing with. And so ironically, at dinner right after that presentation, two students sat down, and I could tell it was going to be tense, so I sat next to them and started to debate abortion. We're a Catholic campus. We're also a campus that sometimes has students who are really politically progressive. So I think like many campuses like ours, abortion is really difficult to talk about. The Catholic Church is clear about its position. Many of our Catholic students are very clear about their support for the pro-life movement. But we also have Catholic students clear that they think abortion should be legal, or that they think women should get to have a say, or that they think it should be something that is between a woman and her medical doctor. So it's complicated, right? And one of our students on the trip was from our Students for Life group. She had been harassed on social media as a result of her activism, her political opinions, and the way she talked about that on campus. And she shared that with the group. And another student was very pro-choice. And these were the two that sat down to talk about abortion at a dinner table in Jerusalem, in a convent of all things. So, having just had this conversation about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and about peacemaking and about dialogue in that context, I was able to use what those two Seeds of Peace staff had offered as advice on how to do dialogue as these two students talked. And we were able to solve nothing, to be clear. No one's mind was changed. And yet we were able to pause the conversation a couple of times to ask both young women what they wanted to get out of it, what was their goal for the conversation, what their personal needs were around the issue. And I do think that they both made progress in listening to each other. It was such a meaningful moment that one of the students that was sitting watching this talked about it in her journal from the trip. This is the power of teaching dialogue. It doesn't become something that has to happen over there where there are worse conflicts. It instead becomes something that we do in our daily lives. It becomes a tool for dismantling oppression, for addressing white supremacy, for handling big gulfs in our culture that seem impossible to cross, and for us to even understand as forming us as human beings in relationship to God. Theology is about our images of God, but theology is also about our images of human beings and using our imagination to ask those questions with intention and reflection. And so my question for you is, how do you imagine your students? How do you think about them? Who are they to you? Your image of your students that you use to influence your teaching is probably, sometimes at least, an unexamined assumption that impacts how you are in the classroom, how you engage with them. If you think of them as people who need your wisdom, even if you think of them as sheep who need your guidance, how does that change how you try to share knowledge with them? If instead you see them as partners, you see all of you in the same interconnected web of humanity, how does that change what knowledge looks like in your classroom? My invitation for you as we go into the rest of this conference, as you go into your summers, is to examine your concept of who you think your students are, who you think you are as a teacher, and how that relates to who you think God is. I hope that in exploring those questions, you can develop ways that dialogue is a tool in your classroom that you can engage with purpose, but also in a way that feels faithful to who you are called to be in the world.